Thanks for joining us online as part of Kings Harbor Church. We love that the Lord has given us this grace of technology for us to connect together around His Word, but we also recognize that it's a resource, not a replacement. And so if you're new with us and you're not connected to a body of believers, our hope is that you would take next steps to be known and for us to know you. In fact, at the end of the sermon, we're going to share some really tangible steps that you can take to connect with us. As we enter in today, it's part of our series called Lost and Found. We'll be in Luke 15, walking through this picture of the heart of God for lost things and challenging ourselves to engage the mission in the same way. So we're excited to see the way the Lord will shape us and use this for His glory in our lives. Morning, church. Good to be with you. This morning, we're going to be finishing our series Lost and Found in Luke 15. And let me just catch you up if you haven't been with us. We've been walking through these three parables that are in Luke 15 as Jesus' explanation to why He's pursuing tax collectors and sinners. And we've used that kind of as this paradigm to look through, these lenses to look through, to think about, well, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the ways that we've realigned our staff and our priorities and our programs? Like how does that help us? And we've looked at our mission statement a few times, and there's a phrase in there, making disciples. And we've spent some time talking about what does that mean? There's a difference between making disciples and finding disciples. And the last couple of weeks, we've really admitted that this idea of making disciples in our current context, I'm sure it's always hard, but it feels especially hard for a couple of reasons. One, because our culture, our world, and maybe even us as believers at times have said we can get the kingdom without the king. And then second of all, that there's this sense of those who've never experienced it, if we're not reflecting it to them, how would they know? And so as we land the plane this week, we're going to look at the final portion of the parable of the father and his two sons. But let me start by telling you a story from my life, and I think it'll actually help us put things into context. And so I'm actually the third of my parents' children. I'm the youngest, but I have a nephew that's a year and a half younger than me. And so because of the closeness in our age, we're actually more like brothers than we are like uncle and nephew. In fact, when we were in school, I told him, don't call me uncle. That's weird, because your uncle's the weird old guy that shows up at your wedding that you're hoping doesn't embarrass you. I'm not that guy. And so other thing you need to know about us, we were a pro wrestling family. So somebody in our house was trying to like clothesline or headlock somebody in our household at all times. And so I can remember being in around sixth grade, and my nephew Theo is in fourth grade, and he had a friend over one morning, and they were hanging out in our bedroom, and our bedroom had a ceiling fan that had this glass bulb light on it. And one of the two of them decided that they were going to backflip the other one from one bed to another. And as that happened, somebody's foot hit the glass bulb on the ceiling fan. It hit the floor. And I'm in the room and I see all of this happening. And I was just like, I'm going to do the right thing here. So I just walk into the living room and go to my dad and be like, hey, here's what happened. Theo and his buddy were doing their thing, and like they broke the ceiling fan. And part of me is telling you this because it's the right thing to do. Part of me is telling you this because I don't want to get in trouble for it. And so I'm just letting you know. And when my dad walked into the room, saw what was going on, cleaned up the broken glass, he couldn't ground Theo's buddy. I wish he had. But he grounded Theo and he grounded me. And the whole time I'm like, wait. I didn't do anything. Like I probably should be in trouble because I didn't do anything to stop them, but I also didn't do anything to help participate. And he said at the moment that you're the older one. Like you should have been taking responsibility and watching over them and making sure that they didn't make this mistake. And there's a reality that when you're the older one, there's a responsibility that comes with it. And sometimes that the weight of that responsibility feels kind of lame, but yet that's what we interpret that role of being the older sibling as having as a part of it. And so as we look at the older son, we need to think in some language about responsibility. And so let me walk you through how the text is gonna break down. And then I'll jump into our main idea. So here's our table of contents. In verses 25 through 28, we're going to review the Father's kindness. In verses 29 through 30, we're going to ask the question, what's behind the reaction that we see in those verses? And then in 31 and 32, we see this gentle reminder in place of a rebuke. So here's our main idea. Jesus' open-ended conclusion to the parable leaves room for those listening to consider their response to God's work. Will they continue to remain outside in frustration, or will they engage with joy? So let's pray together, and then we'll jump into the final part of this text. Jesus, I thank you. I thank you that even by leaving what we'll read open, that there's this space for invitation, for us to accept the invitation to join you in the Father's work, to draw those who are lost to yourself. And so, Lord, would we as listeners hear and receive and respond in the way that gives you glory and brings us joy. It's in your name I pray. Amen. Luke chapter 15, verse 25 would say this. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. In verse 28 it says, but he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him or pleaded with him. And so one of the things I mentioned is when we're reading through parables, that if we end up with an interpretation of that parable, an understanding of that parable that's different than somebody in that first century would have understood it as, then we've not understood it rightly, that it's got to fit in that context as much as it fits in our context. And with that in mind, when we read this, we've got to imagine what they would have heard in that moment. So those Pharisees and those scribes who were wrestling with what Jesus was doing, that they're standing there and they're listening, and they hear Jesus telling this story, and he's walked through this younger son who's gone off and thrown his inheritance into the wind, this father that's been waiting for him and fell on his neck and received him. And now we have this portion of the older son, and immediately as they heard that, they're probably wrestling with two things. One of those things goes back to the story that I started with, that there's this sense of when the older sibling comes in the picture, that the older sibling carries this responsibility. They're the firstborn or the oldest that comes in and knows what to do because they've been in the household the longest. And so there's probably this sense of when they see that character in the story in contrast to the younger brother, and we've walked through this for multiple weeks, so you know how this goes, but hearing it for the first time, it probably feels like, well, that guy, he's probably the one that we look to, and like the 99 sheep that were never lost, and like the 9 coins that did not need to be found, that this is the one that always stayed in close proximity to the person with authority. In fact, they're the one that shows this is what it looks like to be submitted to and put yourself under the leadership of what's right and good. And so there's probably this picture of when they see older, they think wise, responsible, helpful. But then there's also probably this thing that runs in the back of their mind that older isn't always better. And I don't just say that as the third child of 3 children. I say that in this reality that when you read the scriptures and you see pairings of siblings, that your first thought should be that the older is most responsible, but most often there's this contention between the older and the younger because the younger seems to be the one that gets favor. And so we can go as far back as when we see the story of Cain and Abel. Cain is the older brother, and he makes a sacrifice that the Lord does not accept, and Abel makes a sacrifice that the Lord accepts, and Cain's response is to kill his brother. That we see that all throughout the Genesis family line, that over and over again it seems like this younger brother gets more favor than the older brother. And so Ishmael and Isaac being half brothers, that Isaac is the beloved son that's the promise of God, and Ishmael is the son that kind of gets pushed to the side. And there's this tension there that when we look at Jacob and Esau, twin brothers, that Jacob, the younger brother, manipulates his brother, takes his birthright, convinces his father that he's the older brother to receive the blessing. There's this tension there that Joseph and all of his older brothers, that his older brothers dislike the favor that he has so much that they plan to kill him. And then they back up and say, that's probably too far. We'll just sell him into slavery. And so like even that tension between those brothers, and even the picture of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, when they're being blessed by Jacob, there's this tension because Jacob crosses his hands and begins to bless the younger instead of the older. And there's this tension because it's always supposed to be the older that's first, but it doesn't seem like the older is always best. And even as we read this story, we don't know much about what the older is going to be if you're hearing it for the first time. But there's this tension. Is he going to be the older that serves, loves, carries the responsibility like the image of the older is supposed to? Or is he going to be like so many of the olders that we've seen, that when they're supposed to step up and live faithfully, because they don't get the favor that they desire, that somehow it turns their heart and their efforts away from the Father. Well, we'll find out as we keep going. But what we see in this picture is as he walks up and he's hearing this commotion, this party, and I love that this party is loud enough that as he's coming up on the house that he hears what's going on. And so he pulls a servant to the side. He says, "Hey, help me with this. What's going on? What's happening? I didn't know Dad was throwing a party. I didn't know that there was an occasion. I didn't know that there's a holiday going on. So explain to me what's happening." And he says, "Hey, your brother that was gone, he came back, and your dad killed the fattened calf, and we're celebrating." And I just want to go back to where we were last week. This is just such a lavish picture of the Father's kindness. It's his willingness to spend deeply and broadly and extensively to show the joy that he has in the return of his son. That there's this feeling of that when you look through the scriptures about killing a fattened calf, like that didn't happen every day, but on special occasions like the Day of Atonement, when they celebrated that the Lord had taken away all their sin, they would kill a fattened calf. And that's the type of party that's going on in this story. That the son came home because he believed in this type of kindness. And last week we spent a lot of time talking about that idea and saying that kindness goes after those that repent, but it also gently confronts those that will not. And we see this picture of this repentant son being received with this just unbelievable, we used the word last week, reckless level of kindness. But we also see a second picture of kindness, because when the older son hears that his brother is being celebrated, verse 28 would simply say it this way: but he was angry. That instead of celebrating, instead of going in, instead of being like, "Oh, give me my party hat and let's go," there's this tension in him, and he, in contrast, is angry. And here we see the Father's kindness again, that when he refused to go in, that just like he did with his younger brother, the Father would go out to him, and the Father would go out to him and plead with him. And imagine being in that scenario, and in the middle of a party, you're celebrating your one son who is so far away and he's come home, and your other son who you always thought was near seems to be inching farther away because he won't enter in and enjoy the joy that you're having. And he loves him enough to take off the party hat and step outside and go to him and say, "Come in, come join me." It's just a second picture of the Father's kindness. But here's what we see in verse 29. Here's his reaction to his father's kindness. He says this: "But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you. I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.'" And so here, the angst of what he's saying, like before we get into even dissecting the ways that he begins to explain himself, hear the way that he talks about his brother. He doesn't say, "This my younger brother." He says, "This your son." As if he's distancing himself from him, like I don't want to have anything to do with this dude. And he just begins to list out, like, this is your son that went off to a far country and he spent what you gave him with prostitutes. He lived in an impure way. And contrast that to me. I, your son, who has been here this entire time. I've served you tirelessly. I've done everything that you've asked me to do. You give him the fattened calf that's for special occasions, and you wouldn't give me a young goat. That didn't even cost much. You've treated us unfairly. And think about the depth of the angst that he's feeling. Let's just add some layers to it. Because if his younger brother spent his portion of the inheritance and he comes back and he gets a robe and a ring and sandals and a fattened calf, whose robe, ring, sandals, and fattened calf, whose are those going to be ultimately someday? You're cutting into older brother's profit margin with your celebration here. And so there's this frustration that he's probably feeling, in that you're giving him my stuff, and I don't even get my stuff yet. That he was unfaithful and wasted what you gave him on this, what we said earlier, riotous living. Here he's more specific in sexual impropriety with prostitutes. Like he's living that way and you're throwing an all-out party. I've done what I'm supposed to do and it feels like I get nothing. And the question that we need to ask is, what's the question behind the question? What's behind this reaction? Because it feels like there's something more going on than just, he doesn't deserve it. Maybe the other side of it is, but I do. Maybe the deeper question that he's asking is, have I not done enough? Have I not been faithful enough in the way that I obeyed your commands? Have I not worked hard enough? Have I not been near enough? Like he goes far off and makes all these mistakes and you celebrate him. What am I not doing that's enough for you to love me in the same way? And I think that's a really interesting question because I think we face that question in the depth of our souls more often than we want to admit. Recently, I've been reading this book. It's called SECULOSITY, which any book with a title that has a made-up term in it, I'm in. And so seculosity is the combination of secularism, looking to things that are not of God, and religiosity, this idea of being religious, at least in your function and actions, but maybe not transformed in your heart. And the author, David ZAHL, just smashed the two words together. And the whole point of his book is oftentimes when we look out at the world, they would say they're not religious, but they've actually just turned secular endeavors into their religion. And so he begins to list things like parenting and technology and affirmation at work and all of these things that we've ran to. It's an extension of the idea that we talked about a couple of weeks ago of trying to have the kingdom without the king. And he says, but at the base of that question is not, I don't think God exists. The base of that desire, that search, that question is actually this desire to prove that I'm enough. And so here's how he would talk about it, not just in the space of secular ideas, but actually how enoughness seeps its way into our faith and our Christianity. He would say this: you may have noticed that the strands of seculosity we've explored thus far all operate more or less identically. They cast a vision of enoughness and then implore us to realize that vision with forbearance, grit, and hard currency, for the sake of existential reward. So here's what he's saying. He's saying all the things that he's talked about previous, all the other things that we've ran to and tried to make them our places of worship, that they've promised us this idea that we'll be enough, and that if we work hard enough, if we bear enough of the burden, if we give enough of ourselves for it, that we're going to have this reward that validates our existence. He says this: if you eat well enough, if you love well enough, if you parent well enough, if you stay busy enough, then you will be enough. This is the promise at the heart of what we might call a religion of law, and it applies to every replacement religion under the sun. Furthermore, as anyone who has tried to hang their self-regard on a target of seculosity finds out, enough turns out to be a mirage, ever retreating into the distance. And hear the depth of the son's complaint. He says, Dad, all these years I've served. All these years I've done the things. I've checked the boxes. I've done everything that you've asked me to do. How come that wasn't enough? All these years that I've obeyed you and listened to you. And so he's taken seculosity, he's putting a collar and a robe on it, put it in a choir and said, let's make it more religious. I've done all the things that I'm supposed to do to honor the Father, and how come I'm not being validated for who and what I am? That's a scary question for all of us. Maybe you haven't wrestled through it, but I'll just tell you, I spent a lot of hours sitting on a couch in a counselor's office in Lawton, Oklahoma, wrestling through that very question. How do I prove myself to be enough to be loved? I've talked about this in other settings about how I battle with perfectionism, and perfectionism is this idea. And when you hear that, you think, okay, I have to do everything right. And there's an element of that there, but it's also this idea of I'm going to set a standard, and when I get to that standard, I'm going to be enough. And when you get to that standard, it's never enough. And so in my ministry life, I've felt that, okay, if what validation is having a church of a certain size, when I get to that size, I'm going to be enough. And then when you get to that size, you're not enough. And being right in the right theological tribe, if I run with the right guys, then I'm going to be enough. And then when you get there, you're not enough. And if I speak at the big enough events and have enough notoriety in my name, I'll be enough. And when you get there, you're not enough. And to ZAHL's point, that we can keep chasing this mirage of being enough, and it just keeps running farther and farther and farther away. And what we see in this picture of the older brothers, there's something behind the complaint. Dad, why am I not enough? Why is what I've done not enough? And then we hear the response of the father, and it doesn't address the doing, it addresses the being. Verses 31 and 32 would say this. And he said to him, son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And so, I want you to watch what the father does right back to him. You said it was my son, but I'm saying that this is your brother. Don't forget that. He was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he has been found. But maybe more profound than that is the way that he responds to him when he says, haven't I done enough and obeyed enough? His response is, you've been with me. That more than what your brother did of saying, give me the stuff and I don't want to have anything to do with you, you've gotten the best I can give. You've gotten all of me. You've gotten this witness, you've gotten this closeness, you've gotten this proximity to me, to be around me, to know my heart, to know my affection, to see me day after day. I want to be with you. That's the greatest gift I can give to you, that you being close to me matters to me more than all the stuff that I've had to expend. That instead of rebuking him and saying, how dare you? Because oftentimes when we read this text, we're thinking about it in the bigger context. So Jesus is talking about these Pharisees and these scribes, and he's making this analogy. And what we want him to do is we want him to light up the bad guy. We want Jesus to make this point that, look, you're not as righteous as you think you are. You're not as faithful as you think you are. You can't do enough. And in fact, it's a lot of what we do when we talk about the gospel, that the gospel strips us of this kind of meritocracy of proving ourselves by the ways that we've done enough or been enough. But the Father doesn't do any of that. He doesn't say, well, actually, son, here's all the ways that you haven't obeyed me. Here's all the ways that you've been unfaithful. In fact, you standing out here having this argument with me really lowers your standing. Instead, he says to him, you've always been with me. Be with me. There's not anything that's mine that's not yours. It's this reminder of where he stands with his Father, as opposed to this rebuke for maybe the arrogance that he's operating in, that he deserves more than what he's gotten. It's this call of the Father to this idea of relationship and contentedness. Come be with me. Instead of striving for more and exhausting with yourself, with trying to manufacture by your ability and by your obedience this affection from me, you've already got it. Come be with me. And then here's the hard thing about the story. It ends. Like, we don't get the nice Lifetime movie, tie a bow on it with the credits running at the end of it and everybody's happy and Fido runs through the background playing with the ball, and it's this nice story of the older brother walks in and he hugs his brother and says, bro, I'm glad you're home. Nor do we get the heartbreaking type conclusion where he never goes back in. We actually have no idea. It just feels like this cliffhanger, and that's intentional by Jesus because he's trying to make the point to his listeners, what you're witnessing in this moment of me enjoying, celebrating, having a relationship, that this is the heart of God, that this is the picture of the kingdom, to come near to those who were dead are now alive, those who were lost and now have been found, and you can stand outside and murmur and complain, or you can enter in. And the open-endedness gives us this challenge, this sense of he's not just talking to them, but he's inviting us to wrestle through the same. And so again, our Main idea is that Jesus' open-ended conclusion to the parable leaves room for those listening, not just in the first century, but even today, to consider their response to God's work. Will they continue to remain outside in frustration, or will they engage with joy? And I want to do two things here. One, I want to clarify the invitation, because there's two of them, and I hope that whichever party you land in, that you'll accept. And so here's the first invitation, that those of us who've been as if we were dead and lost because of sin, that the Father's heart over and again is to make you alive and to allow you to be found by him. The book of Ephesians would use this language that it would talk about that we are dead in the trespasses of our sin, but by the grace of God, we have been made alive. And that language that the Father's using of the younger son is beautiful language to remind us that if we have been separated from God, if we've chosen our sin over him, that there's this invitation that he will make us alive again. And that invitation didn't just stand for those tax collectors and sinners. It didn't just stand for that younger son. That stands for me and for you, that the reason I can stand here and preach this gospel without fear is because I recognize that what Jesus has done through the breaking of his body, the shedding of his blood, the giving of his life on the cross, is that he's made a way for me to come back home again. He's made a way for me, though I was dead in sin, to be made alive. And if you're watching and hearing this, I don't want it to be lost on you that while we're talking about the reason that the heart of our church is being molded in a particular way, that if we can talk about the strategy and we miss you, then we miss the point. You're the reason. That this is the heart of God, that he's pursuing after those that are lost, those that are dead in their sin, and saying, there's an invitation to be made alive, to come back to me. And so if that's you, and if you're experiencing this, again, I've said that this has been one sermon over 6 weeks, that this is the point of the sermon for you, that there's an invitation and a celebration to follow. Don't miss it. In our culture, we have made a term for this. It's called FOMO, the fear of missing out. It's this idea that there's something going on that's so spectacular that you don't want to be the one, that the reason that you found out about it is because you were scrolling through Twitter and Instagram, but you weren't there. And so it's this idea of, if it's happening, if there's an invitation, I've got to get there and I've got to be there. And there's a lot of cultural wonkiness and foolishness in that. But there's something when it comes to the kingdom that's deeply true. And I have a fear of you missing out and not knowing the kindness of the Father, that he said, come, be with me. But then there's also a second invitation. The second invitation is for the older sons and the older daughters who've never left the Father's house, but maybe they've missed the priority of what he's called them to be a part of. Let me use these terms. I actually used them back at the end of last year when I was preaching through Psalm 1, because I was talking to you about the tension that was happening in my heart with the way that I have been walking with the Lord. So I can remember all of my Christian life, people well-meaning would say, you need to do something for the Lord. And I don't think that's wrong. Like, I think we should give our lives in submission. It's that Romans 12 idea that my life is a living sacrifice, that he gets all of me. And there's always this language, but it was always this language of doing something for the Lord, for the Lord, for the Lord. It was this doing, this accomplishing, this was doing something on the Lord's behalf. And I didn't get a lot of conversation around being with the Lord. And the theologian Augustine, he used this term, this idea of withness. That instead of this forness of what you can accomplish, it's this idea of being with the Father in a way that's different than just doing the work. So let me use an example from my life, and then I'll come back and try and apply it to all of us. When I was in college, I was at the University of Oklahoma, and we had a campus ministry called Chi Alpha. And Chi Alpha was we gathered, we had groups, it was essentially a campus church for lack of a better term. But the hope for those who were in Chi Alpha, if you were already a believer, that this was just a way for you to be on mission on campus, and if you were not, to ultimately connect you to a local church where you could grow and serve and contribute. And so where we had Chi Alpha was in a strip mall that was shared by a Papa John's, a tanning place, various other different retail locations. And part of the reduction of the rent for Chi Alpha was that I think 2 or 3 days out of the week, they had to clean the trash out of the strip mall. And so that strip mall was right there on Fraternity Row. And so you had all of these frat houses around it, and particularly Thursday and Friday. That's kind of when the weekend started on campus. And so if you were cleaning on Friday morning, it was going to be awful. Red Solo cups galore. And like you were going to be picking up beer bottles, that type of deal. And one of the things that if you were going to be in student leadership at Chi Alpha is that you had to serve in some capacity. And one of the capacities was cleaning the strip mall. And so my senior year, I got to be part of student leadership, and I got to start cleaning the strip mall. And so my morning was actually Wednesday morning, and I didn't know how this went. I'd never done it before, and so I show up that morning, and it ends up being me, and I thought it was going to be by myself. And my Chi Alpha pastor, Greg Tiffany, shows up, gloves in hand, trash bag, and said, "Hey, let's go." And that started early in the fall semester, and Wednesday after Wednesday, we would clean the strip mall together. We'd have conversations. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, I know there should probably be some kind of discipleship in this. Like, he should probably, like, walk me through some curriculum. We should read a book together. We should learn something. And so about November of that year, it took me multiple months to get up the courage to ask the question. I finally said, "Hey, when are we going to start doing something? When do we start studying something and writing something? When am I going to like learn to teach? When am I going to begin to do some of those things?" And he said, I just wanted to be with you. Like, the best way I can shape you is to let you see my heart and be around me and hope that becomes contagious for you. My only goal in doing this was just to be with you and also to serve the need of our strip mall. But I don't need you to accomplish anything. I just want to be with you. What if we believe that to be true in our relationship with Jesus? That he doesn't need us to accomplish anything, that he just wants to be with us. How would that change when you wake up in the morning and you've hit snooze 3 times and you know you're supposed to do your Devo reading, you're kind of rubbing out your eye and you're like, "Oh man, I got to do this." And there's this sense of duty, because for you to be a good and faithful Christian, you have to do this thing. But instead of doing this thing for God, what if you just had the freedom to be with him, and reading your word was this opportunity to just spend time together? What if going to church, I know I'm hitting on a fault line here, but let me just speak it. Well, instead of it being this duty that you got to fit in, and it's kind of this awkward time of the week, and if you have something better to do, you don't want to do it, but you got to do some things for God, so you got to make it twice a month, so that way Pastor Mike doesn't make fun of you for only coming 2 times a month. What if it became this opportunity to be with God and be with the people that he loves, and it was more about withness than doing something for him? What if the ways that we built out our life, and so there's an organization called Launch Global, and it's raising up people to go to unreached people groups for the rest of their lives. And one of the training mechanisms that they use is they just give this mechanism of 3-2-1, 3 hours with the Lord daily, 2 hours a week where you're trying to spend time with people who do not know the Lord, and 1 hour a week of together with your team in intentional prayer. And they just tried to make it incredibly simple. Like, what if that was that simple for us? What if our definition of being with the Lord wasn't this striving for enoughness and proving ourselves and doing enough, but it was just, I want to be with you and spend time with you. And so I'm just going to block out portions of my life, not because I have this duty or I'm trying to find a way to make myself enough. And so I've got to be at this activity and this study group and this community group, but I just want to be with you and be around what you love. I just want to have your heart for the things that you have a heart for. What if that's what drove us and motivated us? What if we served from that standpoint? What if we who are more mature saw and understood that the Lord was calling us with him to enter into the lives of those that are less mature than us? And so every time there was a call to serve, it wasn't if I have to, But what if it was this, I get the opportunity to be with you while you do this? What if our walk with the Lord was bring your kid to work day? And so the Lord says, hey, I'm about to change the world and make it new, and I want you to come alongside with me, and I know that you can't really do very much in this, but I'm just bringing you along that you might see my heart and enjoy. I just want to spend time with you. And so several months ago, when we began to have the conversation as a church, how do we shift what we're doing? That we recognize that if we put all the weight on, we've got to hit these boxes and do these things by this way so that we can do something for God, we've missed it. And what if it just became more simple and we said, hey, let's start with gathering together and worshiping. Let's move from there to being with one another and caring for one another, because that's where we will find the Lord. And then what if it moved to then us who are more mature, helping those who don't know as well come along the journey with us as we're with our dad. They get to see the kindness of our dad with us. And what if we just cleared the deck of everything else? What if we just said if we could simply do those things well? And I'm sure there's so many more things that we could add to that are good and right and valuable, but all of a sudden it becomes what ZAHL says, that we're running after all these things with forbearance and with grit and with hard currency, that we might receive some kind of existential reward. What if the reward is just being with him and we didn't even care what the venue was? What if our joy was that we get to be with the triune God, and it doesn't matter if he's with us in this building, or if he's with us in a parking lot, or if he's with us in somebody's backyard, or if he's with us in a prayer closet by ourselves, that we just want to be with him. Let me rewind you back before we end. Remember when you had a crush? When it was that guy or that girl that you were just infatuated with? And you just wanted so deeply to be around them and to be with them. You didn't even care what you did. I remember having crushes where you'd have that phone conversation and it's late at night and you are tired and both of you should probably go to sleep. But instead of hanging up the phone, you just wanted to have this sense of witness. And so you just kind of sat on the phone and just breathed into it. And like looking back, it was awkward and weird and shouldn't have happened. But you didn't have anything to say. You didn't have anything to do. You weren't trying to accomplish anything. You just wanted to be with them. What if the Lord stirred that in us again? And here's the other thing about that was so weird. Like, you actually started caring about the people that person cared about. Like, their friends. So that your guy, his gross friend that like all he did was tell jokes that you didn't want to hear, but you liked him. So you were like, okay, I'll just deal with that friend. And then all of a sudden you have a heart for that person. You love that person. Or that girl and her friend that were just like, she does not stop talking. She does not come up for air. And all of a sudden you love her and know her birthday. That somehow, because you are with the one that you care so deeply about, that you begin to care about what they care about. What if our desire was driven by witness, not enoughness, not forness, and we walked with the Lord? What if it's more simple than what we're making it? What if it's just about adoring him and spending time with him, and out of that living in a way that says, I care about what you care about. I care about my brothers and sisters who need to be cared for because they're struggling. And I also care about those who've not known your kindness. And so like we talked about last week, what if then we're spurred to go show it to them? And so I want to challenge you as we get ready to move into our questions. There's two invitations. And both of them kind of end up being the same. Or do you want to be with him? If you've never trusted Jesus, if you've never loved and trusted what he's accomplished for you on the cross, here's a great opportunity to hear the invitation. Come and be with him. Come and be made alive in a way that nothing else can make you alive. But then let me also say to the believer in Jesus Christ, come and be with him. Not SECULOSITY dressed up in a choir robe, but being with him out of delight and saying, I want to be with you, and I'll go where you lead me to go. I'll enter into what you want me to enter into. I'll experience the love for what you love. Come be with him. So in a moment, I'm going to pray, and we're going to have a couple of questions for you to talk through it. And if, as you hear that, if you're saying, I need to repent and be renewed and to join in this celebrating of what the Lord has accomplished, and that's happening for you for the first time, call somebody and say, here's what the Lord's stirring in me. He's invited me to come be with him. And same thing if you walked with the Lord for a long time, but this is shifting something in your heart and mind to be reminded about witness. Would you share that with somebody? Would you challenge one another as you answer these questions? Hey, how did you do with the questions from last week? And would you take time to hear what the Lord might say through someone else to encourage and challenge you to walk with him faithfully? Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you. I thank you that you don't love us because of how hard we have served or how well we have been able to obtain our own obedience. But you invite us through this story and so many others to be with you. That this is a thread that lines beneath the scriptures, that over and over again we see this deep desire for God to be with us. And it's never made more clear than the naming of the Son as Emmanuel, as the proof of God being with us. And even when you get ready to ascend, one of the last things that you say to these disciples, some who worshiped and some who doubted, is that you called them to a task, and then you reminded them that task flows from the reality that you will be with them. And so, Lord, would you draw us into being with you, not just doing things, but being with. And would you give us the discernment to know the difference? It's in your name I pray. Amen and amen. Again, thank you for being part of Kings Harbor Church Online. At the start of this video, we shared that we wanted to help you connect more deeply. If you're watching this video on our website, there are some buttons below that I think are really good practical steps for you to take to connect with us. Number one, if you're new here, there's a button that just says New Here. And it allows you to share a little information about yourself and allows us to follow up and set up a way to get to know you a little further than just knowing that you came to our site and watched a sermon. Second, we also desire to pray for you, to come alongside you. And so there's a button below that says Need Prayer. And if you click on that, it allows you to share a little bit of information and your requests, and our team will be praying with you and for you. We also just want to emphasize over and again that what you're experiencing is just the ongoing starting point of your discipleship with Jesus. It's just the beginning of the journey. And our desire and our hope for you is that you would continue to walk with him more faithfully over the days. And that may look like entering into a community group where you're doing life on life and living out the gospel together. That might be the courageous step of committing your finances, being generous towards the mission of the church by giving on a regular basis. That might mean trusting the Lord to use you. And we often say here that we don't just dismiss you at the end of a sermon. We send you back in the world to be part of God's mission, to reflect his heart for lost things. And so whatever that next step is, we just want to encourage you to trust the Lord in it and to show that trust by taking that practice and making it a regular part of your life. We're excited and we can't wait to hear what the Lord's doing in and through you.